Good morning. We are in the Gemara on Kuf Gimel Amud Beis 103b.
They must have had yelling and screaming matches in these Gemara.
I hope they were more civilized, but I'm sure they had passionate
Very passionate
discussions, I'm sure. Okay. Where are we? We are. Well, there's some stories in Gemara about, right? Some of the sages stared at other. Yeah. Okay, we are to 5 lines from the top of the page, the second word, Amemar. So what we're discussing here is this idea that once you, well, there's 2 ideas that converge here, actually. And these 2 ideas actually have 2 different simonim, 2 different chapters in the Shulchan Aruch. Both of these ideas are discussed more at length in Brachos, which is why we're not going to go down to the Shulchan Aruch from this one, because it's really only a little piece of the puzzle that comes much more in Brachos. And it's really only brought up here in relation to Havdalah, as we'll see, which is the main subject, which we will get to at least some of the Shulchan Aruch with regard to Havdalah, because also Havdalah, a lot of it's in Brachos too. Anyway, the discussion here is two ideas. The 2 ideas are, number 1, that wine has its own bracha, even when you're in a meal, as opposed to other foods. That when you make hamaitzi, the beginning of a meal, it covers all the other food, but this is not true of wine. Now, there's a discussion whether this is true of this is wine, or is this any drink, or what about alcohol and other alcohols? We'll leave that alone. But principle 1 we're dealing with here is that wine gets its own bracha even if you're in the middle of a meal. Principle 1. And principle 2 is that if you're not expecting another cup of wine, or if somehow your mind's attention is diverted from that drinking, then when a new cup arises, make a new bracha. We have different stories to that effect. Namely, when a person, we have 2 levels actually. One is a person makes a bracha of wine at the beginning of the meal, and it covers all the wine in the meal. And then level 1 is the person does benching, birchat hamazon, and the person is holding a cup of wine while doing the birchat hamazon. And now that birchat hamazon is over, wants to drink that wine, has to make a new bracha agafen. It's printed in our
right at the end.
It's printed in our siddur or bencher because of this Gemara, right? We're reverse engineering, right? Okay. So after benching, a person has to make another hagafen, even though before I benched, I knew that hagafen was coming. And we said already before that the drinking of wine is independent of your meal. And yet, because you've benched, which indicates a break in the meal, a new bracha hagafen afterwards. Furthermore, even if I said, Rabbi Levi benchin, Rabbi Varech, or in the Gemara's language, Havlam v'nivrach, or in English, let us bench, or let us do grace. So as soon as you stated you're going to conclude your meal, so now you've stopped eating, and anything you drink afterwards is to make a new bracha. But the birchat hamazon you do after will cover that wine which you made an extra bracha on after you decided you're going to bench. That was level 2. Then we had this other incident where someone was in Reish Galusa. He was at the Exilarch as a guest there. And every time a new cup of wine came to him, he made another bracha. What's the reason? Because he had no idea another was coming after him. He got a cup of wine. He was thankful. He wasn't expecting to be honored with another cup of wine at the Exilarch, but was. So no bracha. And a new bracha again on its own.
But if you're at a host's house.
But a host is a different story, because at a host, when you're at someone's home, your intention is to eat whatever you're served. Right. And the same thing's true, by the way, if your wife is serving you. You don't need to know at the beginning of the meal what you're going to be serving throughout the meal, because to begin with, when you make the bracha, your intention is to eat whatever she serves you.
So when you're at a wedding, sometimes at weddings, the waiter will come and pour wine automatically, and sometimes they won't.
But the default is when you drink the first cup of wine, if you have nothing in mind particularly, the default is that you're expecting to drink whatever you're being served. So if I get another glass of wine, unless you come to a point where you're like, I had too much, I'm not drinking anything. And then someone else offers a new wine, you're like, you know what, I'll have another glass of wine. Then you have to make another bracha. because you specifically
Said you're not-
detached yourself from the drinking.
But let's say we're having dinner and you say, "Rabotai nevarech," and I stop you and I say, "No, wait, we're drinking."
Okay, so I have to make a new bracha. You wouldn't necessarily have to,
Exactly.
because I decided to finish, so I'd have to make a new bracha. You didn't, so you wouldn't have to. Yeah. Okay. So in that regard, it says the Gemara the following incident, fifth line from the top of the page, second word. Amemar, Marzitra, Ravashi, three sages of the Gemara's era, at the end of the Gemara's era, actually, toward the end. So we're going down in generations here. Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, Kuf Gimel Amud Beis, 103b. You got it, yeah?
I went the other way thinking.
Yeah. One of the copies is printed backwards. So Amemar, Marzitra, and Ravashi are sitting together. Havayasvu, so that they're sitting and enjoying a meal. Again, this is the last generation of the Gemara. Rav Ashi is actually one of the final redactors of the Gemara. Rav Acha berei de Rava. Rav Acha, son of Rava, was mentioned in one of the earlier stories. Was mentioned in one of the earlier stories. So his son Rav Acha is attending to these three scholars. I mentioned this yesterday. It was not uncommon for students to attend to their masters, the scholars, and literally behave like butlers. And this was an opportunity to learn from their masters. So Rav Acha is attending, Rav Acha, son of Rav, is attending to Amemar, Marzutra, and Rav Ashi. Now, each of these three behaved differently with regard to the wine they were served. Amemar, brich akol kisa v'kisa. Amemar made a bracha on every single glass of wine that was poured in. Okay? Marzutra, brich akisa kama v'akisa basra. Marzutra did what we do, which is what Rava did earlier in one of the previous incidents, which is he made a bracha on the first cup of wine at the beginning of the meal. That covered his whole meal. And then he made a bracha on the cup of wine that he drank after concluding the benching. He held a cup of wine during benching, he made a bracha on that, which is what we do. One bracha at the beginning of the meal covers all the wine in the meal, and then a bracha at the end after benching. That was Marzutra's action. And Rav Ashi, brich akisa kama, v'sulay brich. Rav Ashi made a bracha at the first bracha, and then didn't make any bracha afterwards, even on the glass of wine he held during the benching. I should note this. This is different than our practice. Our practice is we don't necessarily hold a cup of wine every time we bench. And even if we did, only the leader would hold. But there is the custom, and there's quite a few incidents in the Gemara that indicate as such. And the Rambam mentions this, that the Shulchan Aruch also mentions this, at least as one option, that every single time a person makes benching, they hold a cup of wine, the same way you would over Kiddush. It's a koishel bracha, koishel a blessing. So it would seem here that all of them held a cup of wine for the bracha, and all of them, Marzutra and Amemar would have for sure made a bracha on the wine they drank after benching. Amemar, because that was his practice, bracha at the beginning and bracha at the last one. Marzutra was anyways making a bracha on every single cup of wine. So certainly he was making one on the last one. But Rav Ashi didn't do that. Rav Ashi made a bracha at the beginning of the meal and then drank a cup of wine after benching, but did not make a bracha agafen on that. Okay? So three different sages sitting there doing three different practices. And presumably they all got along. Yeah, just joking. But yeah, there's no indication that they
mentioned this
squabbled over this.
Towards the end of the Gemara. I mean, what we're studying was towards the end of it?
This particular event is toward the end of the Gemara's era.
This event.
Yes. The earlier events are earlier in time.
But what we're studying, the Gemara or whatever, this is like the end of the book?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah. So
how can I talk about the end?
Okay, so end of the Gemara, I mean end of the generations of the Gemara.
Okay.
So the Gemara is not written like a normal book,
right,
which is one author that goes from beginning to end in order.
Yeah.
Every time these conversations were revisited, like they were attached to the text, and the text kind of grew over time.
Okay.
So these people sitting there would have had the Gemara minus this event, but then the next generation would have included this event into the thing because it's relevant to the discussion. So it's like patchwork, where they keep on adding conversations and statements to this Gemara until there was the final redaction at Ravina.
So it could be in the middle of the Gemara and talk about the last generation.
Correct. So which is often the case where the Gemara at the beginning will cite to something that it writes
way later.
because it could be someone else 3 generations later who already knows what it says later and is commenting, right? So it makes for more difficult learning. So, but as you learn more, you start to see who lived where, and you start to like know how to place things in their kind of proper order. So this event is much later, which actually will explain something that comes up, because the Gemara actually is going to get back to a story I mentioned way earlier. Just like, why is it doing that? So clearly there was one story, but then when that story was studied later, other stories were added into it because it's relevant.
So this is all written way after it all happened, technically.
Or it's written as it happens, and it keeps on being added as it's happening.
Okay.
Or so I don't know who would have added the story, but let's say Ravina would have added the story. Maybe Rav Acha himself, who's attending, would have added the story in, something like that.
Could it be that they have different roles? Like one maybe considered a guest in the ex-Lark's home, and therefore
The 3 of these?
yeah,
These 3? Okay, let's see.
right?
The Gemara, so Rav Acha was attentively going to ask them.
Really inconsistent with
Rav Acha is going to ask them, and there he's going to explain the position. Okay, so Amalahu Rav Acha bar Rava. So Rav Acha, son of Rava, who's attending to them, asks, but this is how he asks. The phrasing is very interesting, and that itself teaches us a lesson of how to approach Torah learning and respect when asking the question. He says like this: Anan kaman nevid, us, who should we follow? In other words, he's not like challenging them so much as asking them for guidance, considering that they all did something different. So he's looking at them and saying, well, okay, what should I be learning from all of this? What should I do? Anan ma kaman nevid, us, who should we follow? So each of them explained their position. Amemar said, Nimlachana. Amemar, who made a bracha on every single one, he said, Nimlachana. Every time I drank a glass of wine, in my head, this was the last cup I was drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, a new cup came, I made a new bracha. So this is consistent. So far, this is consistent. That if you make a bracha at the beginning, it does cover all your wine. But in Amemar's case, he wasn't expecting. He actually made a decision on not drinking anymore, but then kept on drinking as they were coming to.
he was an attendant.
No. Rav Acha was the attendant who was asking. Amemar was one of the people sitting. It just so happened that every time he drank a cup of wine, his intention was, I don't want to drink another one.
That's what he's expected.
Correct. No, Nimlach actually Nimlach is not, the word Nimlach here is not just a passive, where I wasn't sure if I was going to get another cup of wine. It's an active, I made a decision, I'm done.
Oh,
But then got another cup of wine and drank again.
right.
He's the guy at the Fabrengen. He's the guy at the Fabrengen who says, okay, that's my last l'chaim.
Right.
But then his friend says, come on, another one. He said, okay, fine. But every single time, being a little joking, but yeah.
Last one.
Exactly. That's the point. Nimlachana. I had made a decision to stop drinking after every cup. And therefore, whenever I got a new cup, I had to make a new bracha. So far, this is consistent, right? This view is consistent. Marzutra said, well, I did get Talmid Rav. I followed the students of Rav from the previous story. So you see how this is a generation later, talking about a story that was before. So these people would have had the Gemara with that story mentioned before. And now whoever is observing this would have added this story into it because it's relevant to the story from before, right? So Marzutra says, I am following that story in the Gemara, which we just read before, which is the students of Rav who would make a bracha at the first cup, covering the whole glass of wine. Benching is considered a break, and I make a bracha after the wine that comes after benching. Okay? Rabashi told him, look, in my view, less hilchas akadamid Rav. I disagree with them.
Wine is separate.
Wine is separate from meal, and I make a bracha at the beginning of the meal. It covers all my wine, even that which I'm going to do after benching, because wine is independent from meal, which means the rationale we gave yesterday, which is, right, what was the rationale we gave yesterday from Rashbam, which I actually looked up in Alta B'Shulchan Aruch, that rationale is there, which is, what kind of after bracha do you make on wine? You make the abbreviated version of the long benching, which is what we call alagefen. But alagefen is an abbreviated version of the long Birchot Hamazon, which therefore, says the Rashbam and says the halacha, if you're doing the full Birchot Hamazon, certainly it covers the wine if the miniature version of that covers the wine. So Rav Ashi would reject that argument and say wine is independent from your meal. And perhaps he wouldn't look at it based on what you said, meaning what bracha you said, but in terms of how you approach eating these items. And the approach to drinking wine is independent from your eating a meal. And because it's independent from eating a meal, the Birchot Hamazon is on your meal, but my wine meal is not done yet.
Right, so you can't use that analogy.
And exactly. So in his
It doesn't
correct.
work.
So how do I approach it? Do I approach it from the way in which I verbalize my brachas? And if I did so, if that's how I approach it, then brachas habazon ends the meal, including ending the wine meal, and anything comes afterwards to make a new bracha, which is the halacha. But Rav Ashi would reject that and say no. The drinking of wine is independent of the meal, and even if I benched, my wine drinking isn't over, and therefore no new bracha hagafon afterwards. Right, which would be interesting because on the Seder night, there's a whole to-do, which we'll get to later, about how many brachas hagafon you have to make on the 4 cups of wine. We, certainly the Chabad custom is, I don't know if there's other communities that have different custom, but the Chabad custom certainly, which we'll discuss when we get there, is that every single time you drink one of the 4 cups of wine, you make a new hagafon. Even though you didn't bench between cup number 1 and 2, you don't bench, and between cup 3 and 4, you don't bench. You bench after cup number 2, because your meals, then you bench, then you make a new bracha hagafon on cup number 3, which you held during benching. Cup number 3 of your 4 cups is over the bracha hamazon, right? Now there is the view that says that you actually don't make a bracha hagafon on cup 2, because it's already covered by your number 1, and you don't make hagafon on cup 4 because it was covered by number 3. The only one you make hagafon on is cup number. The only one you would do is cup number 1 because it's your first time drinking wine, and cup number 2 because that comes after your benching. Cup number 3, I'm sorry, because it comes after your benching, which means according to Rav Ashi, you wouldn't make a bracha on that one either, if you were to follow that view.
But it's
independent.
But if the Passover, they're like not. It's like a new. It's not.
So that's the other view. So the other view is. That's right. So the other view is, which we'll see, is because each bracha is its own, because each cup is its own mitzvah, it gets its own bracha hagafon, which we'll have to discuss when we get there. I wrote about this. If it's its own mitzvah, why are you making a bracha hagafon? You should make a shekel shel mitzvah v'tzivanu, a bracha on mitzvahs. We'll get there. But be that as it may, it would seem from Rav Ashi that you'd actually only make. Let's say he rejected this argument that didn't and wasn't of the view that you have to make a new bracha every time because it's a new mitzvah, because it actually is one big mitzvah, one unit of a mitzvah, right? In fact, I don't want to get too far on this because we're going to revisit it. But the halacha is we don't make a bracha. Why don't we? We make marar is only rabbinic, but we make a bracha marar. Right? The bracha every time you do a mitzvah, we make a bracha. So when we eat matzah, we make a bracha. We make hamaitzi, but we also make a bracha thank you for the mitzvah, and we make a bracha thank you for the mitzvah of marar. Why don't we make a bracha thank you for the mitzvah of the 4 cups? And one of the reasons is the dominant reason is because that mitzvah is divided and split up. You can only make a bracha when you're about to do the whole mitzvah right now, but you're not going to do the whole mitzvah right now. You're going to do first now, then later, then later, then later. Right? From that perspective, then actually all 4 are one mitzvah. So why are you making a hagafon 4 times? And indeed, there's a view that says you don't make a hagafon 4 times. Only on cup number 1 and cup number 3. And if Rav Ashi would go with that, he would actually say you only make a hagafon on cup number 1, not even number 3. Because in his view, benching doesn't constitute an ending in your drinking wine. It only constitutes an ending of your benching. Right? Presumably. Now, since you mentioned that Rav Ashi is coming at the last stage of the Gemara, the Rashbam has to go through a whole explanation here and ask us, why aren't we following Rav Ashi? We follow, right? We make a bracha after hagafon, after we bench, which means we follow the students of Rav, and we follow a meimar.
Like now, it's always.
That's the halacha. Everybody agrees with this halacha. That you make a
Even if you had the intention of drinking.
If you make a, yeah, that's right. Even if you knew, well, you're holding the cup when you bench, so you know you're going to drink it after benching. But because you benched, it's considered an entel amelia to make a new bracha hagafon. That's the halacha. This is at length in Kufay and Tes. Even if you said Rabbi Levi Nevarech, you'd have to make a new bracha hagafon. That's the halacha. Right, but the Rashbam goes through a whole discussion here. If Rav Ashi is the end of the Gemara's era, shouldn't we follow him because he has the last word? And explains, but because he has 2 colleagues there, Meimar and Mar Zutra, who both disagreed with him, he's in the minority. But because even Mar Zutra, who made a bracha on every single cup of wine, agreed. Sorry?
They disagree with each other also, no?
Who? Meimar and Mar Zutra? Yeah. No, they agreed. But Mar Zutra explained that I had intention to stop. Right?
Yeah, he was
exactly. Which means he himself does. That's correct. So
the same mentality.
Exactly. So Mar Zutra agrees that in theory your first bracha hagafen covers everything, and that benching would be in a break.
Mhm.
And that would be like, how much the more so from the fact that his intention considered a break, certainly the benching would be considered a break. So we can put Marzutra into that camp too.
So during the Shabbos meal,
Yeah.
if you drink, you make your bracha at the beginning.
Yeah. It covers all the wine in the meal.
And if you do it in between, does it is it harmless or is
What do you mean by doing in between?
I'll take
Okay, no
Is
problem.
that only the person who recites
No.
Kiddush or for all?
Yeah.
That's maybe only one person. Right?
Oh, very good question.
What? Sorry.
Very good question. Does the person who's making Kiddush, he says hagafen, certainly the hagafen he makes covers all the wine he's going to drink
Wine is covered.
the rest of the meal. What about everybody else?
Yeah, who are not making.
Good question. Are they tasting from the Kiddush?
Yes.
They are. When they taste from the Kiddush, are they making hagafen? That's the question.
Oh, that's the,
Should they or should they not? Making hagafen?
Generally, we don't do it. We're supposed
But
to.
do you ask? Sorry?
I don't know. For me at home, like if my dad does kiddush, for example.
say
I don't
amen.
do
So
that.
you're saying amen, you're fulfilling your mitzvah via listening to their hagafen.
Yeah.
If that's your
That's the
position,
case.
then you made the hagafen at the beginning of the meal. You made it by listening.
by listening.
And if that's not your position, and you're making hagafen when you get that sip of wine, then you made hagafen anyway. But if you didn't drink from the Kiddush wine,
And
which
you-
is perfectly fine, you fulfill your obligation even if you don't drink any wine. The main thing is to say amen. Let's say you didn't drink any wine, then the first time you drank wine at the meal, you have to make hagafen, and then that covers the rest of your meal, even if it happens to be after you washed.
So if you had the wine, then you don't have to say.
Correct. Because if you drank the wine at Kiddush, you made hagafen. Either you verbalized yourself hagafen, or you made hagafen via entering amen.
You knew that you were having wine. So
That's the assumption.
that
That's correct.
bracha is covered.
That's right. In other words, shemeya ka'oina, one who listens and answers amen, it's as if he said the bracha. So either I said the bracha by proxy, or I actually said the bracha. In either event, I made a bracha. That is, if I drank from the wine of Kiddush. Otherwise, if the first time I drink wine at the meal, I'd make a hagafen. That would cover everything after. Okay.
Sometimes the wine is really like separated from the meal, but you would
Certainly.
it still applies like the halacha that you said. It's still for example.
That benching considers the end.
Yeah.
Yes,
Even if it's.
that's right. Because
Even if
benching
it's
is
part
an
of the
elaborated
individual.
version of your alagefen. That's why. It's an elaborated version of the Birkat Hamazon you would have made on Kiddush on hagafen anyway. Right?
This is all.
Sorry,
This is all. We're talking about Shabbos and Yom Tov.
but this is treated in a
No,
weekday as
this
well.
applies for everything.
Weekday too.
That's right.
If there are differences where you're during the weekday, it's more considered separate.
If you drank wine before the meal. So there's a discussion
I
there.
don't know.
Okay, so I'll tell you what you're talking. I'll tell you what I think you're talking about.
Between weekday.
I'll tell you what I think you're talking about. This is relevant to Havdalah also. When you make Kiddush by the meal, it is understood and actually halachically linked to your meal, because we learned that at great length. You have to make Kiddush in the place every meal, which means when I sit down to make Kiddush at my table, that Kiddush is like projected over the meal I'm about to eat. And therefore, any wine I drink during that time is covered in my Kiddush. Right? But what if, like, you're invited to someone's home
Yeah, that's what I was.
and you have a glass of wine first in the living room, these fancy old fancy dinners, and then you go to the dining room to eat.
A wedding hall.
That's right. And then you drink wine again there. Is that first wine linked to the meal that comes later? It's a good question. It's discussed in Allah with different opinions. Whether you actually have to be drinking that first cup of wine after meal, if it's done before you wash. Right? And the same thing is true of Havdalah. Havdalah is not linked to your meal. But what if right after Havdalah you're gonna be eating a meal? Your Malav Malka is right after Havdalah. Can my wine that I'm making Havdalah cover the wine I'm gonna drink after I wash? Because I make Havdalah, wash, sit down for a meal, and then drink some wine then. So will the Kiddush and Havdalah cover the wine that I'm drinking in my meal just like it would my Kiddush? So there are two different opinions. Is the meal set and I'm making Havdalah at the same table? Maybe I have to wash before I make the Havdalah. So wash, Havdalah, and then make Hamotzi. And that way it's linked. There's all kinds of discussions in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's discussed in Brachas, and it's one of the pieces of the, meaning this is more than one piece of the puzzle, much more of which is discussed in the Masechta Brachas. Yeah, but it's all discussed. So you're correct that there's a difference there. And it would also be linked to what we talked about earlier. If you make a bracha in one room and you're expecting to move to a different room, does it extend? Does it not extend? That would also be related.
So one is Havdalah, one is for your meal. So then it's like that thing where you're using a mitzvah for two things. You're not giving it enough.
Not giving enough attention.
that
Yeah.
it needs.
Well, no, in the case of Havdalah, so I made Havdalah, but I just don't do that. I just don't do Ala Geffen. I go straight to washing for Malav Malka.
Oh.
So can I just continue drinking and then make Birkat Hamazon at the end of my Havdalah,
Then
my meal to cover everything?
It's fun to just
You
what to use it for your meal. I don't get it.
No, you're just making Havdalah. You're making
Without
Havdalah.
Geffen, you could do
No, with Geffen. You're making Havdalah with Geffen. You drink the wine,
Yeah.
but you don't do Ala Geffen. You don't do Birkat Hamazon on your Havdalah yet. And you have a Malav Malka.
Okay.
You wash and have Malav Malka. And then you're going to do Birkat Hamazon. You're going to bench at the end of Malav Malka. But now during that time, I drink wine. Is it covered by my bracha from my Geffen or not? With Kiddush, it would be, because Kiddush is directly linked to the meal, but Havdalah is independent of the meal. I happen to have attached it. So this becomes a discussion of halacha also, to what degrees it's attached. All kinds of opinions. Okay, two more lines, and we'll close out with that, because we'll get to the next discussion on Monday, which is about the Havdalah candle. Okay, so Rav Ashi said, I disagree with the students of Rav, and that's why I make one bracha at the beginning, and I cover everything, even to the hagafen that's coming after the benching. So, says the Gemara, Rav Ashi proves why Rav Ashi gives proof why he disregards the students of Rav, and says that you don't have to make a new hagafen after benching. Why? Da Yom Tov shechalias achar Shabbos, Yom Tov, which happens after Shabbos. Right? It's Saturday night and it's Yom Tov, which is our original discussion. You have to combine Kiddush and Havdalah. V'amar Rav, and Rav said, Yaknaha. You make Kiddush and Havdalah together. You make Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Havdalah, and you would put Shechianu in, but that would be only if Shechianu is relevant. Right? Okay. The only time this Yaknaha would be Shvi Shal Pesach. Because otherwise you're making Shechianu. Either way, it's Matzah Yom Tov, it's Shabbos. It's Matzah Shabbos, it's Yom Tov. You're making Kiddush and Havdalah together. Now Rav Ashi says, look, you're making one hagafen on Kiddush and Havdalah. And we don't say that because you made Havdalah, you made a break and you have to make, or because you made Kiddush, it's a break and you have to make a new wine. Make a new hagafen. So from the fact that one cup of wine can extend beyond two brachas is proof to me that the wine can extend beyond benching also. Now, how would you reject that?
Benching closes off the meal, no? Or that they're not related?
No, but yeah, no, continue. Yeah. Rav Ashi's arguing, you say even further. This is what Rashbam says it. If it's Kiddush and Havdalah on Matzah Shabbos, which is going into Yom Tov, Kiddush and Havdalah one together, you make one cup of wine for both of these brachas. What if you were someone who was poor, or not God forbid, no one here, someone was poor, couldn't afford more than one cup of wine, and had to bench also. And now he's combining one cup of wine for Kiddush and benching. Or for Havdalah and benching. When did he make Bayer Piragafen? On the Havdalah. When is he drinking it? After benching. Do you make a new Havdalah? You make a new Bracha Hagafen? No. So you see, benching doesn't break in your Bracha Hagafen. Because if you were to combine Kiddush and Havdalah, and if you were to combine Havdalah with benching, you would not be making a new Bracha Hagafen after. Yeah. To which the Gemara says, V'lohi. This is faulty logic. Lohi, this is incorrect. Because Hassam, over there, by the case of benching, Akar daitim in Mishtiya. He makes a decision when he benches that his meal is over. But Hacha, here in the case where you are holding the cup of wine for Havdalah and Kiddush, he didn't, his mind was not diverted from drinking it because he was holding it the whole time. From his agafen until he drinks, he was holding it the whole time. He just made Havdalah and benching in the middle.
There's a difference between actual breaking and mind.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, looking again
Even
at
though there's a physical detachment, it's not a mindful detachment.
because he has not only that, Rashbam adds because he didn't even drink it yet. You made hagafen.
Oh, you didn't drink it yet.
You didn't even drink it yet. You made hagafen. You make Havdalah and you bench. What you make another hagafen. You didn't drink the first cup of wine. You made hagafen on the first time. When you make hagafen on your first cup and you bench, now you're done with that cup and you're drinking a new cup.
Yeah.
But in the case of where you're combining kiddush and Havdalah together, or kiddush and benching together, or Havdalah and benching together, when you make hagafen, your mind is still attached to that original hagafen because you haven't even drank the cup of wine yet, and you're holding it in your hand the whole time. You haven't even drunk it yet. So certainly then you wouldn't make a new bracha. So there's a bit of a combination here in that it's the verbalization of benching along with what's my relationship with the wine I drank or the wine upon which I made a guffin. The wine upon which I made a guffin the first time at a normal meal, that wine I drank already, and if I'm benching, I close that one out and a new bracha guffin after. But if I'm combining Havdalah and Kiddush, Havdalah and benching, then the cup of wine upon which I made a guffin, I haven't drank it yet. So my mind is still attached to that hagafen. So certainly I wouldn't be making two hagafens on one cup of wine. And that's what the Gemara rejects Rav Ashi's position. So this ends the section of the Gemara that discusses this whole idea of making more than one bracha on cups of wine, which again is really more discussed in brachas, and this is just one piece of the puzzle. And now the Gemara is going to get back to its original discussion, which is the Havdalah. And we're going to discuss the candle, the nature of the candle that you have to hold. Right, we know the custom that we have to have a torch, more than one wick. The source of that idea is in the Gemara we're about to read on Monday, and we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch that discusses that. And then from there, we're going to get to the text of the Havdalah. That language comes from the Gemara here also, and the Gemara is going to discuss it at length, and we'll look at that as well. Okay, wonderful day, a good Ner Shabbos.
Thank you.